The wind howled across the dry plains, carrying the scent of dust and despair. The small wooden house at the edge of the dying town looked like it could crumble with one more bad storm. Inside, a woman lay bruised and trembling on the floor, her torn shawl clinging to her like a final shield. Her name was Mary Ellen, and life had given her more pain than mercy. Her husband, a cruel man hardened by drink and disappointment, had beaten her again, this time because she had given birth to their third daughter. The cries of the baby echoed faintly from a corner cradle. Mary Ellen reached out weakly, her hand shaking, as her husband slammed the door and disappeared into the night. The silence that followed was worse than the blows. It was the silence of being unwanted. The neighbors knew but did nothing. In towns like these, people looked away. A woman's suffering was just another thing swallowed by the dust. Miles away, in the wide emptiness of the Texas plains, lived a man who had forgotten what warmth felt like. His name was Thomas Reed, a rancher with no family left. The ranch he owned stretched further than the eye could see, but every acre felt empty without laughter, without life. His wife had died 10 years ago, and the child she carried with her. Since then, he spoke little, rode alone, and slept by the window listening to the coyotes cry. That night, Thomas had ridden into town for supplies. He tied his horse outside the general store, his broad shoulders dusted with trail sand, his hat shadowing his weathered face. He wasn't a man people spoke to much. There was a distance about him, the kind that said he'd seen things too heavy to tell. But when he stepped inside the store, he saw the sheriff whispering to the clerk. Their voices were low, but Thomas's ears were sharp. Dan Miller beat his wife half to death again, the sheriff said. Folks say she's barely breathing. Poor woman's got 3 girls and no one to stand for her. Thomas's hands clenched. He'd heard that name before. Dan Miller, a man meaner than a snake and twice as cruel. The law never did much. Men like Dan knew how to slip through its cracks. Thomas set his supplies down. "Where's she now?" he asked, his voice deep, gravelly. The sheriff looked up. "Home, I suppose. Ain't got nowhere else." Thomas didn't speak again. He just turned, walked out the door, and mounted his horse. The night was thick, the stars pale through the blowing dust. He rode hard, the hooves pounding through the silence, until he reached the Miller place, a shack half broken, lights flickering inside. He dismounted quietly. Through the window, he saw Mary Ellen kneeling by her child, her face swollen, her lips split. He saw the blood on the floorboards and the fear in her eyes. Something inside him, something he thought had died years ago, stirred. He knocked once. When she didn't answer, he pushed the door open. The hinge groaned, and she turned sharply, clutching her baby close. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Name's Thomas Reed," he said. "Rancher out west. I heard what he did." She shook her head, trembling. "Please go. If he finds you here, he'll—" "He won't find me," Thomas interrupted. "He won't touch you again either." Tears filled her eyes. "You don't understand. There's nowhere for me to go." Thomas's voice softened. "You're coming with me." The words hung in the air, solid and sure. She looked at him as if he'd spoken a miracle. "I can't," she whispered. "He'll come after me. He'll take the girls." Thomas glanced around. 3 little faces peered from the shadows. Frightened, silent, too young to understand but old enough to know fear. He crouched down, removing his hat. "No man should raise his hand to a woman," he said softly, "and no child should grow up watching it happen." He helped her to her feet. She swayed, dizzy, but his hands were steady, strong. He gathered the girl's few belongings, a doll, a blanket, a worn Bible, and led them to his horse. Mary Ellen hesitated at the door, looking back once at the house she'd lived in, the prison that had broken her spirit. She felt the cold wind on her bruised skin and shuddered. Then she took the baby tighter in her arms and stepped out. They rode through the night. Thomas placed her on his horse, holding the reins while the girls rode behind in the wagon he'd borrowed from the livery. He didn't speak much, but every time she winced or coughed, he slowed the pace. When dawn broke, the horizon turned gold, and she saw his ranch, miles of open land, the grass bending under the wind like waves on a sea. A small house stood near the corral, smoke curling from the chimney. He helped her down gently. "You'll be safe here," he said. She looked around in disbelief. "Why are you doing this for me?" He paused, eyes distant. "Because once, someone should have done it for my wife. But no one did." That morning, he gave her his late wife's room, washed the blood from her face, and told her to rest. The girls clung to her skirts, not used to kindness from a man. Thomas cooked for them, awkwardly but with care, beans, cornbread, and warm milk. When one of the girls smiled at him, his chest tightened. It had been so long since laughter lived in his home. Days turned to weeks. Mary Ellen healed slowly, her bruises fading, though the scars inside took longer. She learned to help with the ranch chores, feeding chickens, milking the cow, tending the garden. Thomas never raised his voice, never demanded, never pried. He simply worked beside her, quiet as the land itself. Sometimes, she'd catch him watching the children play, his eyes soft with something she couldn't name. One evening, after supper, she found him fixing a broken toy horse for her youngest. "You don't have to do all this," she said. He looked up. "I know. But I want to." That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay awake listening to the wind outside, the same wind that once carried fear but now brought peace. Then one afternoon, Dan Miller rode up the dirt path, dust rising behind his horse. His eyes were bloodshot, his mouth twisted in a snarl. "She's mine," he shouted. "You got no right to take her." Thomas stepped out of the barn, slow and steady, his revolver hanging loosely by his side. "You forfeited that right when you raised your hand to her," he said evenly.
Dan dismounted, rage boiling.
"You think you can steal my wife? My children?" Thomas's voice turned low. "They ain't yours if all you ever gave 'em was pain." Dan reached for his gun. The girls screamed. Mary Ellen rushed to the porch, clutching the baby. The sound of the hammer cocking froze the air. A single shot cracked through the plains. The echo rolled over the hills and was gone. When the smoke cleared, Dan lay in the dirt, his pistol half drawn, eyes wide in shock. Thomas stood still, his arm steady, face unreadable. Mary Ellen ran to him, tears streaming down. "You could have been killed," she cried. He holstered the gun. "Better me than you," he said simply. The sheriff came that night, heard what happened, and saw the truth written in the tracks and the drawn gun. It was ruled self-defense. But Thomas didn't speak of it again. The land absorbed it, like it absorbed everything else. After that day, something changed between them. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful. He built a new room on the house for the girls, painted it white, and planted flowers out front, something bright in the hard soil. One evening months later, as the sun sank over the plains, Mary Ellen walked up behind him as he mended a fence. "You saved our lives," she said softly. He straightened, wiping his brow. "No," he said. "You saved mine." She smiled faintly, eyes glistening. "I was broken, Thomas. I didn't think I'd ever feel safe again." He looked at her for a long moment, the wind catching strands of her hair. "You don't have to be afraid anymore. You're home." Time passed, and the ranch filled with laughter again. The girls ran barefoot through the grass, chasing fireflies at dusk. Mary Ellen's laughter returned, gentle, real. She found strength in the land, in the quiet man who never asked for anything but gave everything. One winter evening, as snow dusted the hills, Thomas brought her a small carved box. Inside was a silver ring, worn but polished. "I ain't got much to offer but this life," he said quietly. "And I'd like to share it, with you if you'll have me." Tears filled her eyes as she looked at him, at the man who had rescued her from darkness, who had shown her that kindness could be stronger than cruelty. "Yes," she whispered. Years later, when their children, his by heart, hers by blood, ran laughing across the ranch, the townsfolk would tell the story of the lonely rancher who took in a beaten woman and her daughters. They said love grew there like wildflowers after rain, unexpected, stubborn, and beautiful. And every time the wind blew across the plains, carrying the scent of grass and new life, Mary Ellen would remember the night he stood in her doorway and said, with quiet strength that changed everything, "You're coming with me."